Hi and welcome. So, I really wanted to talk about this phrase that I kept hearing about this year so much, and it's basically that it's an unprecedented time. It's not a word that I've heard that much, except in recent months, and I've heard it so much over the last 6 or 8 months that the pandemic or alleged pandemic and all the COVID-19 regulations that have since happened have caused a situation that's, to quote, unprecedented. And I really take exception that our lives are in particular, so extraordinary and so unique. Well, yes, to be honest, the situation is unique, but then actually, isn't every situation? Now, I understand some things are more unique than others, but actually, life is always in constant flux and changing. You know, there's always lots of good and bad things that happen in life. If we look back over the decades, just in recent times, we find numerous unprecedented events. Think of the internet revolution in the last 20 years. Many good things as a result of that, perhaps. The technological advancement and our increasing reliance on the World Wide Web. But also, if you look at the darknet and look at all the things that are on there these days, um, you know, the amount of weapons, child pornography, all sorts of terrible things that potentially are on there. You could say that's unprecedented. And, the fact that so many people get different illnesses and cancers, the fact that there's widespread different infections, like Lyme's disease, but numerous other infections as well. Countless, too many to mention. There's obvious ones that come to mind, like HIV and AIDS, TB, of course, malaria, numerous other ones. Those are just the biggest ones, of course. And we look at just the last few decades then, we are living in unprecedented times. We were years ago, in the post-millennium, we had the war on terror, and we had all the terrorism as a consequence. Unprecedented times, one could have said, and it was, and it still is. But hasn't life always been like that, although to a varying extent, but things are always changing, and there have always been bad things and new bad things that happen, and on huge scales as well. If you were to talk to an elderly person today and say, oh, it's unprecedented, it's so unique what's going on in the world, they might well respond and say, well, I went through a world war. Actually, that was unique. That had never been seen before. The extent of the war, that it was in Europe, in China, in Africa, South America, and the amount of people that were affected by that. The civilian casualties, 60 to 70 million. If you want to talk about unprecedented, the Second World War, and the First to a lesser extent, certainly. And after that, of course, we had the sex revolution, we had colonialism, a struggle for independence amongst First Nations and Aboriginal communities. But if you want to look at it in a wider context, the colonialism of the last 400 years, that's unprecedented too. So this word of what's unique, Western colonialism and the occupation, look at the scramble for Africa, the fact that the vast continent was occupied by the French, British, German and other European armies, unprecedented. So we're not living in totally unprecedented times, really. Yes, today is unique, but the 1990s were unique. Post-millennium and the war on terror was unique. The sex revolution and all the consequences of liberal policies for the family in the 1960s and 70s was unique. The technological revolution of computing and the World Wide Web in the 80s and 90s was unique, and all the implications and the consequences of it. But if you go further back in history, we go back to medieval times in Europe, when there were lots of struggles, lots of strife, lots of sectarianism, All sorts of things going on then, unprecedented things, one might have said. In actual fact, it's not confined to any particular millennium or century. Far from it. You could pick any time in history and you could search for unprecedented events that had really severe ramifications. I'll give you just a few examples off the top of my head. Think of the Mongolian Empire. It occupied the largest territory known for any world empire, at least up to that point. It occupied virtually the entirety of Asia. And if it wasn't for the Japanese on the Far East coast, the Romanians in Europe, and the Egyptians, they would have perhaps occupied a lot more. Think of the destruction, the fragmentation that caused to untold millions of people. That would have been absolutely unprecedented. And also, of course, the subsequent fragmentation of the Mongolian Empire as it was divided up and all the results of the social disintegration that would have caused as well. But that's not a unique thing in that sense about the Mongolian Empire. The rise and fall of all empires has that sort of profound effect that is unprecedented in its nature. Whether one considers more recent things like the rise of the Chinese Empire, of course, the Cultural Revolution of Maoism in the 1960s and 70s, and the events after that also. The rise and fall of communism, for example, in the 20th century. One could describe that as unprecedented too. The rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, for example. Of the British Empire, the American, as it is at the moment. And of course, the French and British and all the other European colonialism that I talked about, they would have equally been felt as unprecedented by the Aboriginals undergoing occupation, but also, of course, by the colonisers themselves. Those were unprecedented times. As was the Roman Empire, its rise, its occupation of the Middle East, of North African peninsula, and its subsequent collapse and an invasion by the Anglo-Saxons, the Celts, the Goths, and various others. And the breakdown of the Roman Empire, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, perhaps unprecedented. So we have had a whole conveyor belt throughout history of various unique, unprecedented events that have profoundly affected massive proportions of populations, not just tens of millions, hundreds of millions, with different philosophical, political and religious schisms that have occurred throughout history, throughout millenniums and centuries too. And it's not just human interactions that have caused those things, because there are those people that say, oh, well, look at the amount of natural disasters that are going on today. That also is unprecedented. I've heard people at events like Extinction Rebellion claim similar things to that, that we are on the precipice of an ecological destruction or something going on. Well, certainly there are severe ecological problems within the world. There's a lot of problems with pollution in particular, with land pollution, pollution of the water, the air, and certainly that is a major issue. No one should deny that. Of course it is. But in terms of, pollution, we've had various issues with that throughout millenniums, in fact. You'll find that well documented in ancient records, or what there is of them at least. And if you want to look at natural disasters like earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and the like, earthquakes, you will find records of those causing huge amounts of disaster, death and disablement and homelessness, destruction of infrastructure. You'll find accounts of those throughout the ancient world, in fact, numerous times. So do we really know today whether there are more of those events occurring? How can we actually be sure of that? We have a poverty of information of ancient world records. So not all Aboriginals from all over the world were keeping accurate records of everything that happened. And actually, if you think about it, it stands to reason, if a city is destroyed, its records may also be destroyed too. So it's quite possible that there were more natural disasters than we actually have a record of. We can't really be totally sure, can we? We don't know if there are more of these natural disasters occurring today, or whether there's a poverty of accurate records from ancient times. We can't expect after hundreds of years, or even thousands of years even, for there to be accurate records of all different parts of the world. There's several reasons for that. Not all communities were literate. They didn't all keep records at all. Right? Some didn't keep any. And even those that did keep some, over many years, decades, centuries, millenniums, their records, some of them were decayed, some were lost, some were stolen, some were there were all sorts of things that happened to them. They could be damaged, for example. Or they could be falsified, or we could have a remnant of them, but we don't have a totality of them at least. So we don't actually know completely how many disasters there were in the past. So all those people that say, well, there's so many more natural disasters occurring now, that's based on an assumption of knowledge. And that assumption is that we or they know how many natural disasters there were a few hundred years ago in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in what was Americas, although it wasn't called that then. Well, they don't have that information in any of those continents accurately from hundreds of years ago, never mind thousands of years ago. So the basis for that sort of idea that things are so much worse today, there just isn't simply the evidence to support that theory. Now, it could well be as well that we are more aware today of natural disasters in other parts of the world because of the more and increasing interconnectedness of the world in its globalized nature. You think about, the World Wide Web that we talked about. I'm more likely today to be aware of a famine, an earthquake, or even a civil war that's taking place in another part of the world, between warring tribes, for example, in a different part of the world in Africa or South America. I'm much more likely to be aware of a situation like that just because I can get information from online. Whether it's accurate or not is another issue. Yet I know that there's something is going on at least. Whereas if I was living in medieval Europe, they didn't even know there was an America at one point. Never mind whether there was an earthquake going on there or not, or a flood. They didn't even know there was a continent. So, all this holy maloney about, well, things are so much worse today. You don't know how worse they were in the past to say that. So, unless you're absolutely all-knowing and you have a fountain of absolute knowledge, unlike the rest of us, of course, who have just fragments of history and trying to piece it together and make sense of it, right, then we can't be absolutely sure of anything, really, to make claims like that. But I hear so many bold claims like that don't actually have the scientific evidence to back it up. And so I'm very cautious, therefore, before accepting any of these kind of claims. I think there could well be some truth in it. It could well be that because of our larger populations today, there's an accumulation of more pollution, and that therefore there is the potential for more ecological damage, and I can certainly see there's a strong argument for that in terms of pollution, especially in the 20th century. But if you were to say, is there more warfare today as a percentage of the population? Impossible to say. I look back at the history of various continents and empires, whether it's in India or China, Europe, the Aboriginals, or in America, and I see that there was warfare and conflicts and poverty and death and disease and destruction, and I see that was been going on throughout all history and in all cultures, albeit, of course, to a varying extent. I'm not saying that it's always remained on a flat level, of course, and it's always remained exactly constant. I'm not saying that. It may have fluctuated. It may have got worse, better, worse. It may have gone up and down. I suspect that's probably been the case. A bit like my mood sometimes, to be honest. But I think it's fluctuated, no doubt, and there's probably been times in some continents and in certain regions where there's been a relative amount of stability and peace, and where things have, an amount of prosperity that's been shared. There's probably been times like that, and numerous times. And there's probably been numerous times as well when there's been lots of divisions and conflict, disharmony, lots of disease, and lots of bad things going on. And there's probably been just too many incidences like that. But of course, if you do accept that today we've got an ever globalized world, we're going to be more aware potentially of different things that are going on in the world. Different natural disasters, different conflicts, for example. Whereas in the past, we might not have had any awareness at all, or even there might have been rumours about it, but we wouldn't have absolutely known whether it was going on or not. In fact, that issue still carries on today in a way. You hear about a conflict happening somewhere, but you don't always know the extent of it. You don't know quite how much is going on or how it's affecting people, because you can hear various different accounts, sometimes that overlap or sometimes contradict. So, and that's why it's always important before coming to any kind of conclusion or judgment to actually research issues as thoroughly as possible. Rushed trials make bad verdicts, of course. So, and especially when you're dealing with a vastly complex issue, and if you look at a big picture, you're trying to make a summary of what's going on in the world, you're not going to be able to get there and make any kind of sound conclusion unless you're investing a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of research, therefore. And even then, your conclusions might at best be quite tentative, and you might still, probably will, lack a lot of information, and there'll be a lot of uncertainties still as well. And there's a certain type of humility that's needed, whereas we humans have to accept that there are limits sometimes in our knowledge. Like in our history of civilizations, there are parts of the world that we don't really know about. The further we go back, the less we know, actually, because there seems to be a shortage of records, just because, of wear and tear, to put it in a way, because after many, many years, things decompose, things break down, things get stolen, buildings get destroyed, architecture, records are gone, and so what's been preserved of earlier cultures is only a remnant of it. And so we can sort of make some guesstimates about what might have happened, and there's certainly room for speculation about the past, and the ancient past in particular, yes. But people that would say, oh, well, we know so much to make absolute certain statements, are lacking in that evidence. And that's especially important if you're using those kind of statements as a guide to your life, right, as something you live by, or something, and you're spreading that information to other people. It's really important not to spread information unless you're absolutely sure, or because you could be misleading people, or if you are unsure, to say to them, okay, this is only a guesstimate, or this is the evidence it's based on, and this is the reasoning of why we think this. However, there is a certain amount of doubt about that. You have to put it in the context of how and why you got to that conclusion, right? Or it becomes meaningless. Just a banal statement, really. So I'll go back to my original idea of this unprecedented nature of what we're apparently supposed to be living in. Because I don't think that it is necessarily any more unprecedented than the other things, than the world wars, than colonialism, than the rise and fall of various empires over centuries and millenniums, of the countless natural disasters that have occurred. Those things would have seemed just as unprecedented to those people in those times. Of course they would. They would have seemed just as uncertain, just as mysterious, just as strange and weird and frightening and sad and depressive, and issues that made one angry, and issues that one sought comfort in, and one suffered through, and I hear about that from all sorts of different people that I've met in my life. I've been fortunate that I've met many people from so many different backgrounds in my life. People that have lived through wars, people that have been in prisons, people that have been on the streets, homeless, people that have been through terrible diseases, that have lost loved ones, children, partners, brothers, sisters, people, and we all have, I'm sure. We've met people that have been through hardships, and no doubt we've been through our own types of hardships too. And you as an individual, we can go through something that seems unprecedented for us. You might be going through an illness. You've never been through it before, and it's an unprecedented thing for you, and there may be things that you could relate to, at least, that can help you from previous incidences. I haven't had that type of illness exactly like that, but I have had some kinds of illnesses. Or you might be able to meet other people that have had similar kind of things, similar experiences that you can relate to and learn from. So aren't we all going through unprecedented things in our own lives as well, though? Someone that's losing a partner to a terminal illness, that may well be unprecedented for them, unless they've been widowed before, perhaps. But, we as individuals go through unprecedented things also, not just as a society, but on an individual level we do as well. I can think of many instances myself of unprecedented things I've gone through, being homeless on the streets, being in a psychiatric ward, going travelling without any money on my own, things that I had never done before were totally unique and really strange for me. And that all had hardships, but always had lessons to learn, and things actually through the challenge where I was able to find an inner strength and some resourcefulness to help me through it. And so I think that's really my general conclusion, really, that we all go through different kinds of unprecedented, unique events, really, on an individual and also on a societal level too. But it's how we deal with those that matters, isn't it? Striving to try and find and make the best of situations as much as we're able to. Learning from hard experiences. There's an old saying that good habits prosper in bad times, actually. And that can well be. Someone that's gone through a long-term illness and that struggled with that, may well have learnt patience and have learnt how to cope with situations. Whereas when they were well, perhaps, and they were able to go out, they may have been able to be more demanding and wanting things, quicker, and because they were in that position, where they could do it then. So even bad things can teach us lessons in life if we are prepared at least to learn from those things anyway. I don't want to whittle on anyway, but there are my general conclusions about this idea that we are living in unprecedented times. Yes, we are, but we always have been. Perhaps we're just more aware of it now than we were before, because life's always changing. It's unique today. It was 10 years ago, it was 20 years ago, and 100 years, and 1,000 years ago also. And it probably will be unique in a few years and in a few decades if the world's still here as well. People in the future will look back at us perhaps and say, yeah, you were going through unprecedented times, but we are too now. So who knows? I think life will continue being unprecedented. It's full of unique things that constantly surprise us. But it's good to find reassuring things that are stable, that are dependable. I think that's what's important, actually. When everything else seems to be in flux and in doubt, and you're not sure whether you can trust this institution or not, or this person or not. Even someone who's well-meaning can sometimes let you down, even if they're genuine. We all make mistakes, right? So I find, I suppose, my faith in God helps because it's dependable, it's constant. Not that my faith is always, I have my times of doubt and times when I get things wrong. But I I like to believe that God is there, you know, whether times are unprecedented or not, you know, whether times are good or bad, you know, whether we're feeling happy or sad or whatever hand the world deals us, I suppose, you know. And the sun and moon are still there, and always the stars as well. So, you know, it's nice to rely and have something that's constant in our lives when everything else sometimes seems to be in a fluctuation and a change.